Okay.
Welcome, Mr. Nick Papastergiadis, a name here in Victoria that is very well known, obviously for your brother who's part of the Greek community of Melbourne. And now we're going to meet you, a writer, a sociologist. Nick, welcome to the KK Factor.
Thank you, Rula.
With
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So let's find out about Nick Papastergiadis and Nick's passions and who you are,
Right. Where should I begin then? My passions.
your passions. How did
Uh,
you get to where you are now?
well, I do have a deep passion for learning. I guess, a curious kind of guy who likes to explore new things. I've always been fascinated by art, but the big theme that's run throughout my whole life is the way in which artists have dealt with the issues of migration and the story that our parents went through and that we indirectly go through in different phases of our life. And that interconnection between art and how it represents the world and artists who are interested in the migration topic or have experienced migration themselves has been the central intellectual passion, but also a personal passion as well. Of course, like I have other interests and hobbies, and but that that sort of intersection between art and the experience of migration and how it changes your identity and makes you look at culture in different ways. That's been really at the center of my mind for about 40 or 50 years now, Rula.
Wow. Okay, so I know the topic about migration and the stories about our parents. That's become a very hot topic over the last maybe 4 or 5 years. It's been all over social media. The Greek Center promotes a lot of work, a lot of writers there. Um, how did it evolve to get to that point? Because some of the stories and one of the documentaries that will be part of the Greek Film Festival, um, Anzac, the Greek chapter. When I actually had the privilege of being seeing the opening night, the premiere of it before it actually hits the film night, um, there were things in there that I thought to myself, wow, this sort of history should have been taught to us back when I was at school. The relationship between Australia, New Zealand, and Greece, and it became a big eye opener for me. I learned a lot through that documentary. Um, but what's made it evolve now? What's pushed it now? Is it our generation wanting to know more? Is it because we're losing parents in this generation and we want to know this story? What is it, Nick?
There's a lot of factors there. I mean, you're right. When we were growing up, we were almost ashamed to think about our own past, to try and put a value on the culture that we had come from. We had been, we had grown up in the shadow of the assimilationist era, where you had to sort of, shape up or ship out, where the emphasis on the culture was that there was one dominant form and everyone had to model themselves and mimic as best they could that dominant form. And, we quickly realized that we didn't fit in. There were bits of us that just, no matter how you tried to stretch and pull it, didn't look like or wanted to correspond with that dominant model. We didn't have that blonde-eyed, blonde hair, blue-eyed, pale skin look, and that didn't mean the rest of us were ugly or dumb or stupid. And yet, a lot of us often felt like that, and so we turned our back to our own history and culture, and even important elements, like you say, which would naturally fit in with the dominant culture, like the heroic story of Greeks and Australians and New Zealanders in the Second and First World War. That was diminished. I mean, how many of us grew up thinking that Gallipoli was a Greek town?
No one. No, no, it was the no, that it wasn't discussed.
The word Gallipoli means Gallipoli,
Gallipoli.
right? And yet, the whole of the western side of modern day Turkey, of course, was Ionian Greek culture. But anyway, those stories were completely absent from our education and our childhood, and our parents had limited capacities to value that and communicate that with us. And those of us who went to Greek school probably had pretty ambivalent relationships to Greek school. I hated it personally. I
Same
thought
here.
I thought my teachers were barbarians
Yeah.
99% of the time.
Totally agree with you.
They were brutal and crude and ignorant. Some were very nice. Some, not all. But so formally, we had no pathway to recognize ourselves in the mainstream mirror. And that pathway is normally provided to you by the institution of education. Sometimes it's provided to you by other institutions like museums.
That's right.
And to these days, the museums completely underrepresent our Hellenic past. I mean, if you want to go to any museum in Australia, you'll see a little bit about ancient Greece and almost nothing about modern Greece. You'll see a lot of modern England and America and some parts of Western Europe, but almost nothing of the Southern Europeans.
It is a shame actually, because
We
there is
pay the
such a big,
taxes that keep those museums open.
and not to mention, there was a huge relationship, as you mentioned earlier, World War One, World War Two, between Australia and Greece. They had, we were allies with Greece. We helped Greece, and yet, as you said, at school we weren't learning the history, and there was that gap in growing up. The racism between, you had the skips and the wogs, and I'm sorry about the terminology, but that's what we were recognized as growing up. And I do believe that if it was taught at Greek school, if it was taught at English school, maybe that gap wouldn't have been so huge.
Yes, certainly if it was taught as something interesting, intriguing, valuable, cool, and was taught by the cool teachers, that makes a difference. It's often who teaches it as well as what you're teaching.
What you're teaching, yes.
And so anyway, then I suspect as your generation and mine, I imagine I'm a little bit older than you, but as our generations got to recognize things by our own means, by our own experiences through traveling back to Greece, or our own experience of reading and seeing other films, we started to develop alternative viewpoints. And of course, then there was the whole history of multiculturalism in the 70s and 80s, which to an extent opened up the space for revaluing culture. But that too has been compressed and reduced lately, I think. And so it is a bit of a challenge for people like you and me to really stand up and reflect on our own past and our own heritage and see what's good and what's relevant, what can be used and what can be maybe put to the side or parked for other purposes, and really champion it and be proud of it and not be ashamed anymore.
So where
And
was the turning point with you to then study cosmopolitan lifestyle and putting it all together and
that's a good
becoming
question.
the sociologist? There must
Well,
have been a turning point, because we both went to the
yeah.
same Greek school.
Did we?
It sounds exactly the same.
Oh, well, we all did. When I went to Rubos, which I hated, but I liked my time with Kyrios. I thought by the time I was taught by him, I think he had relaxed and was much more of a gentleman. But in my final year at university, I had the opportunity to write an honours thesis, and this is in 1984, and I wanted to write about various things which my supervisor recognised and knew that were legitimate and valid topics, but he didn't sound that excited by it. And then I said to him, "Well, there's one other topic." He goes, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, I don't know. It's about migration. It's about art. It's about my personal experiences, my parents. But I can't find any literature that links all this together. There's lots of literature that talks about migrants as failures in politics, and migrants as victims from economic exploitations, and migrants who are nostalgic about their past and therefore disconnected from the contemporary culture. But I don't accept any of those paradigms, and I wanted to write something about migrants as dynamic figures in our modern world." And he went, "Do that one." I said, "But I don't know where to begin." He goes, "Find a start." And ever since 1984, that's been topic of concern. And in those days, if you went into a bookshop and tried to find a book about Australian multiculturalism, you might find a policy document, or you might find some Marxist book saying that migrants have been exploited, or some liberal guy would be celebrating the migrant as entrepreneur. But the kind of energy that I was trying to tap into wasn't there. So over the next 40 years, we've seen a very interesting escalation of this understanding of how migrants contribute to the modern world and how they've been a really dynamic part of our culture and have reshaped everything. And so that was my starting point at Melbourne University in 1984. And then I went to England in 1987 to do my PhD at Cambridge. And my supervisor didn't want me to work on migrants in Australia. He thought that was too minor a topic and that no one will take me seriously. So I chose to write about a very prominent English writer called John Berger.
Which you became very close friends with.
That's correct. At the end of my PhD, I sort of focused on his writing because he, in all of his books, and there's 30 of them, more than 30, in all of his books, the central figure is the migrant. The way of seeing that is promoted is the perspective of the migrant. And so I wanted to tease out that perspective and that history and that kind of identity by tracing the way in which it was represented in all of his writing. And as you say, towards the end of my PhD, we became friends until he died.
I'm sorry about that. So he would obviously you worked very close with him, and you created the book An Odyssey of Migrations and Art.
No, that book was called John Berger and Me, but my first
John
book,
Berger and yes, sorry, John Berger and you. That's right.
yeah,
And so tell me first about the book John Berger and Me, and then we'll go on to An Odyssey of Migrations and Art.
okay. The book John Berger and Me started off as a lecture for the Greek community during COVID times, when Jim Bossinakis asked me to give a talk about John Berger because Jim is a big fan of his writing and about art and politics. And I said, okay. But then I realized, having said yes, that it was going to be a little bit difficult to write the lectures, given that all my books on John were at the university office and at
And
home.
everything was shut down.
And I wasn't legally allowed to go to that side of town. And so I thought, what should I do now? And I thought, well, I've got thousands of memories and stories and anecdotes, which I've been telling people over the years. Maybe I'd try and write them up. So every day I sat on my daybed and for half an hour and just wrote a little anecdote or memory. And then I realized I was writing things quite freely and very joyfully, even though sometimes the topics were a bit sad, about missing him or the loss of his life and the significance he had on me and the way it made me think about living with peasants. Because John, at the peak of his career as an art critic and writer and novelist who had won the Booker Prize and was one of the most famous people in the art world in the 70s, he gave up his life in London and chose to live in a peasant village in France amongst the peasants and wrote a book about the peasants who migrated from south of Europe, like Italy and Greece and Yugoslavia, to work in the factories as Gastarbeiter in Germany, Sweden, and Holland. And he literally went to the villages, like, I'm not sure which village your parents come from, but mine come from the north of Greece. Yours?
My mum comes from Larissa, my dad from Kardica.
Well, imagine someone coming to a village in between these two towns and following your uncles as they pick up their suitcase, kiss their mother and sister and brother goodbye, take the bus to Larissa, from there another bus to Athens, and from there a train
To
to
the port.
Thessaloniki, and from there to another train to Vienna, and from there another train to Stuttgart. Now, this is what John did. He literally followed
Wow.
these, mostly men, as they left their villages and went to work in factories in northern Europe. And in those factories, they were allowed to eat and sleep inside dormitories, which had been built like army barracks.
Wow.
So they'd play cards with the other men at night and have horny dreams and fantasize about their wives because they were completely sequestered from normal life. And eventually made enough money to either go back home and set up a small business or bring their family to where they were and then start a
A
so-called.
new life.
And that may be a familiar story to many of us, but that was an unknown story in the 70s. No one was talking about the fact that the engines were being pumped and primed and sustained by wogs, as you call it, wogs who turned the cogs in the factories, right? And he wrote this book called A Seventh Man. And when my mother read the Greek translation of this book, she goes, oh, σαν να ήταν απάνω στους πλάτες μου, να με ακολουθούσε παντού.
Wow.
She goes, it was like, gave her the shivers. It was like he somehow could see inside her head and had experienced the same journey she had made, even though she had gone to the other side of the world. And so John, having written that book, chose to live amongst peasants, living that very simple life, helping them with the hay and any other chores that needed to be done. And but continued to write novels and other essays and things and films and theatre pieces. So he's a real polymath. And so by the time I met him, he was, in his late 60s. And one day he had a motorbike accident and dislocated his shoulder blade. And that year, when it came to doing the hay, to gather up the hay for the peasant neighbour, he wasn't strong enough to do the normal work that he would do with his son and the peasant, who's called Louis. And he rang me up and said, can you come and help? And I said, I'll be there. So I jumped on my motorbike from Manchester. I was living in Manchester then, and rode to London and then to Dover, and then followed all the small roads around the north of France into Geneva and then out back to France to his little village, and spent the rest of the month with him, helping him make the hay and getting to know Louis, the peasant farmer, and meeting all the locals. And I did that every summer and every Christmas ever since.
And learnt their story, listen to their stories.
Yeah, listen to their stories. But what I realized as I started to reflect on this, writing about it here in Melbourne now, many years later, is that it also made me reflect on my father's life, who's also called John, and the village that he left. And I started to realize John left the metropolis of London and traveled away from art to live more simply in the villages. My father left a village to travel to the new world to give his kids the opportunity to be able to experience the pleasures and value of art and knowledge. And I had done this sort of helix-like journey between these two people. And so the structure of the book follows that helix. It's on the one hand telling the story of my relationship with John, the author. On the other hand, it's reevaluating the legacy that my father left in me about the village life that he had abandoned, which I have never directly experienced. But John, the author, gave me a portal, a window to look in and reflect on and imagine really the life my parents had in that village and what its relevance is for the life we have here in Australia at this point in time. So that's what it's about.
Yeah, most stories we hear now is more to do with our parents leaving the peasant life and coming to Australia. But now through John Berger and Me book, we're learning about the ones that, as you said, moved from that lifestyle into the villages, or they've gone to work, they've left the villages in Greece and gone to work in Europe.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm thinking that those stories would have been known within Europe, whereas we got the stories of our parents coming from Greece.
That's right. So they're similar but different.
Yes. But basically, they're all doing the same thing. We need to leave the village to go and find work and to help our families.
But do we entirely leave the village?
That's an interesting question because I know a lot of ethnics that go back and keep going back, but then I know a lot that don't want to go back. They've embraced their new life
That's true.
and they're thanking the land that they're on now that has given them a better lifestyle, but more importantly, for their children.
Yes, but my other question is that physical relationship to the land is interesting, and also the gratitude that, my father was very proud to be a new Australian. He would constantly brag about it in Greece. It was a pain in the ass, in fact. And but in many ways, he was an old Greek. His attitude to the garden, the way in which he treated so many simple things like food and clothes and shelter, the care for family. Those values were shaped in a village for
That's
thousands,
right.
and they weren't static. They changed a little bit, but they were the bedrock upon which, our values were formed.
Yes. Yes. Because it does come from our parents, 100%. So tell me, Nick, the book An Odyssey of Migration and Art. So this is following John Berger and Me,
Well, it's not
or it's
quite as
hand in hand,
no. There was another book called The Cosmos and Cosmopolitanism.
which I want to touch on as well.
There is no book called The Odyssey. That's the title of an article written by a friend of mine about my books.
Okay, so I got confused there. Okay,
It doesn't matter, but I've written a lot about art and migration over the years, so maybe that's the source of the confusion. And there's many books with that kind of title, but the most recent one is called The Cosmos in Cosmopolitanism.
yes.
And
So it, you said that you've written a lot of books about cosmopolitanism, um, and in your books that you're exploring the cosmos and that it's a very difficult word for me, cosmopolitanism. How has art personally influenced or shaped you thinking over the years?
well, that's a great question and a big question. Right at the beginning of the time that I mentioned in 1984, when I was interested in art and migration and politics of art and politics of migration, one of the most influential people that helped me work through that was an Australian, Greek Australian artist and activist called George Michilakakis. He was former president of the Greek community, I think, here in Melbourne. But by the time I knew him, he was an artist, a writer. He worked in factories, but he was a very educated man, extremely sophisticated. And through him, I got to go to poetry events, got to go to exhibitions, which, no one had taken me to such a thing in my life. And it was eye-opening. And very early on, I realized that the way artists see the world is not only just crazy, curious, and wacky, which, a lot of times, let's be honest, it is, but they also have an ability to see between the gaps and to see things deeper and also anticipate changes that are starting to come. So they're like the canary in the mine shaft, They're an early indicator of how the world is changing. And so I became fascinated in the way in which artists were interested in various topics and how they represented and what they said and what in what ways they addressed these issues. And so, for instance, in remember in 2001 when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
Well, a few weeks before 9/11, there was the Tampa crisis here in Australia, and we had the beginning of politics of fear, as you remember, and where John Howard was constantly banging his fist on the table and say, we determine who comes here on what conditions and how long they can stay. We're the boss of this place. That sort of stuff. And there was a lot of vilification of the refugees, if you remember correctly, the way they were children being supposedly thrown overboard. And we see
The stories that we've heard.
yeah, and now Trump is repeating them about Haitians eating their children and stupid stories like that. And this vilification was part of a culture of fear that was starting to dominate the world. And when 9/11 happened, it just became a completely ambient, toxic cocktail that was everywhere. Everyone was paranoid about everything. Well, that's an exaggeration, but you get the point. And what struck me was, no matter how much other academics or other leaders of the church or other heads of the medical association or directors of the CSIRO or all these so-called leaders of knowledge and politics and civic institutions, like the top lawyers, the top judges of this country, no matter how much they said that this culture of fear is inaccurate, inexpensive, is unhelpful, creating harm to other people, no matter what damage was being shown to have been caused by this politics of fear, the politics of fear was being popularized. It became dominant in the way in which people imagined the world. And I thought, this is a real problem. And we need to find other ways to imagine the world other than through fear. We need to have other people who speak about hope. And it struck me that the people who were speaking about hope in the most creative, most imaginative, the most powerful, most humane ways were not politicians, doctors, lawyers, and priests, but artists. They were initiating all sorts of artistic experiments and events to join different communities together, to bridge the differences, to provide opportunities for learning about each other's cultures and to empathize with other people's condition. And I was really struck by all these projects by artists all over the world who were agents of hope. And so they were, in a sense, being good diaspora agents. They were making a good multicultural society, but they were also being driven by an impulse to live in this world as if it's just one world. And in that sense, I saw them as cosmopolitan agents and agents that were bringing forth a cosmopolitan condition. So that in this cosmopolitan world that they were promoting, we were all seeing each other as equals. We're all interested in each other's cultures as an equal culture. And we respected everybody's right. And if we had a disagreement or a difference with each other, that didn't mean that was an opportunity to go into war with each other, but that was an obligation to have a discussion and find common ground. And if we can't find common ground and agreement, to park our differences somewhere until we can at some point later in the future. Because inevitably, if you just cool down for a bit, eventually you do find common ground, even with your girlfriend or boyfriend. That was a
So
joke.
I know. So with your book and other artists' books, do you believe that you can reinvigorate the concept of cosmopolitanism in this globalized world?
Um, that's
And
a big task. I mean, I hope, there was a book I wrote just after 9/11, which took me 10 years to write, and didn't come out till 2012. And that was called Cosmopolitanism and Culture, which looked at the ways in which artists were trying to be bridge builders, right? In this polarized world where global forces were pulling people apart rather than bringing them together, right? And and so I was trying in that sense to contribute to that civic role of making people more connected to each other rather than aware of their differences and promoting conflict against each other. So yes, I was trying to contribute to a deepening and widening of that idea of cosmopolitanism. But just as I wrote the book John Berger and Me during COVID, I also wrote the Cosmos in Cosmopolitanism book during that time. And I had a lot of time to my hands, and I was talking to myself like everybody else was, and staring out the window. And so, to prevent myself from going mad, I tried to write books, and so that Cosmos books came out of that because, you know, as much as I'd written about artists following and tried to follow their example, I also wanted to spend time to understand the philosophical ideals from which the artists were drawing from and what kind of instincts they were referring to, cosmic instincts. And I'd never really had the time to delve deeper into these more abstract ideas and more complex philosophical and political ideas. And so that's what we had during COVID. We had time. We didn't have any space. We weren't allowed to go anywhere, so we weren't wasting our time sitting at airports or, you know, doing other things. So we had time, and
A lot of people had time to become creative
yeah,
or just to sit there. But
exactly.
some people embraced it and turned it into a positive.
Yeah, well, I tried, and the Cosmos book was a sort of more scholarly attempt. The John Berger book was more of a personal memoir. It's written in a very accessible way, whereas the Cosmos book is more of an academic book. I tried to make it clearer, but my brother keeps telling me, no, I still can't understand it. And if I can't, no one can. Well, it's not exactly true, but anyway, but I get his point.
In somewhat way, I've got to agree on Bill on that one. In somewhat way,
Okay,
because
I,
everybody's different, yeah.
yeah.
So I'm learning a lot through these discussions with you, and doing the research to speak with you. I'm learning things that I once didn't really know much about.
Well,
So
thank you. I
sometimes, yeah,
appreciate the effort that you're putting into it, Rula.
well, it's about learning, and sometimes you do need to put into a bit more simpler terms for people, let's say like myself, that don't understand it. And what's a simple way of understanding it to then pass that on to our child or children or, friends?
Well, hopefully, eventually we get there. And if I don't do it, maybe somebody else will. That's the trickle down effect of ideas as well.
You,
Because
you,
sometimes, you know, I write a book and then somebody else writes a book very similar but much more accessible. And so the idea eventually gets out there. But so I'm not that bothered by it. But I would like, of course, my own work to be more widely read and immediately comprehensible. And I'm pretty confident that the Berger book is that kind of book.
yeah,
And the Cosmos book is heading in that direction, but not quite there yet.
okay. In the research that I did, I was reading that the ancient Greeks saw the cosmos as a source of inspiration.
That's right.
Now, how do you see these ancient philosophical ideas aligning with today's multicultural, because we did talk about that earlier, and global challenges?
Well, this is the interesting thing is that, you know, everybody recognizes that the word cosmopolitanism comes from ancient Greece. It's obviously the root has two Greek words, politi and cosmo, you know. And so every political philosopher that writes about the challenge of living with different cultures, the fact that society is more mixed than ever before, that forces are coming to us from lots of diverse places like technological change, economic um, challenges, even, you know, stylistic influences,
We've got our global issues.
all sorts of things like the movies we watch, you know, are mostly from England and America, you know, the fashion that we wear is all designed in Italy but made in Vietnam, you know. It's a complicated world we all engaged in and entangled in. And so we're having to think about this globalizing world. We're have to think a lot about our multicultural realities, like our neighbors are from 150 different countries in the world, according to the statistics of my local municipality. And so, we have to find ways to bridge these differences and coexist with each other. And so, you need some reference points to do that. And so I thought, okay, everyone talks about the ancient Greeks as the origin from which these ideas come from. And, I didn't want to fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, the ancient Greeks thought of it first, got it right. The rest of us are still trying to catch up and understand. And so I didn't want to have that sort of narcissistic, we're the Greeks and we got it perfect, right idea. But when I did look at the theories that the Stoics developed about cosmopolitanism, I was enormously impressed. And I realized that they got something right and got it out first. And because, the idea of living under one political ideal was not unique to the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, the Indians, the Chinese. They all had similar ideas about, oh, it's one world, we all live under the one sun, we all have come from one egg, These are ideas you find in Hindu philosophy, in Chinese philosophy, in Egyptian writing. But what was unique about the Greeks was that when they talked about living in one world, they didn't organize it in this sort of hierarchical order. All the other theories basically said there is one God above us, there's an emperor or a high priest, and then there's the rest of us. So our right to live in this unified world has to be mediated through this authority figure. Whereas the ancient Greeks, the Stoics says, no, we're all equal, and there's no one superior to anyone else. And in fact, it's our attunement with the cosmos that makes us virtuous, makes us able to understand where truth and beauty comes from, and how to live a dignified and righteous life, where beauty and honesty and truth and understanding of your own life, so that you're not consulting a doctor to know what's healthy or unhealthy. You don't need a lawyer to tell you what's right and wrong. You don't appeal to the philosopher and say, hey, tell me what's moral and immoral here. Because you are living this good life, treating everyone as equal, attuned to all the nature around you, sensitive to your environment, connected to the cosmos. And they thought that connection was through your breath, which, pneuma, right? Which is also an idea that's probably close to the Hindu and Chinese philosophy as well. So there's obvious connections across these civilizations, even though they're thousands of miles apart. And so these ancient Greeks had this sort of really radical idea of equality, and that huge responsibility on each and every individual to be the perfect person that they can be by connecting themselves with the cosmos. And of course, they realized that that perfect person was an ideal. No one could ever be all those things all at once. But they set up that ideal as something to live by and to pursue and to measure yourself against. And that was a really wild idea. And they had some other ideas which were pretty crazy about what the cosmos was like. But that's not what's important is this idea that we're all equal, this idea of radical equality, and that we're not organized in this hierarchical way where we have to take orders from our priest or emperor in order to be connected to the cosmos. So I found that very inspiring, and I thought, well, that responsibility that is shifted on the individual, and that opportunity to see yourself being connected with your environment, your nature, and treating all other people as equals. What a beautiful ideal. And the interesting thing is that they not only said this about all other men, as was normal in Plato and Aristotelian philosophy, which tended to valorize the role of certain kinds of men, the men who were independently wealthy and didn't have to work and had no debts. They were the ones who they valued as citizens. The Stoics said all men, all classes, all women, all races could be, attuned to the cosmos and therefore equal with each other.
So how do you see art playing a role in this movement, especially engaging the indigenous cosmologies and building bridges across the cultures?
That's another great question, Rula. Art, when you look at the fundamentals of art, is doing something very similar to what philosophy is trying to do. It's asking itself the questions, who are we? Where do we come from? What kind of life can we live? And where does this thing called creation come from? Because one of the things that shocks artists is that they are making something out of nothing, right? And you're not just modifying something that's in front of you, but you're creating. And when you're creating, you're actually seeing something new come into the world. And when there's something new in the world, you are shocked by its presence because it doesn't have an origin. And of course, you can see what it's made of, but those elements that make it, that with which you have manufactured it, is not the sum total of its identity. It's that, but something else. And that something else is a bit of a mystery. And the Greeks believed that humans were on a spectrum that were connected to the divine, demigods and gods, right? So as a consequence, it's not like God is above us and we are somehow inferior, but we are somehow connected on that spectrum. And this capacity to create is godlike. And that's evidence of our divine capacities. That in fact, that there's a fragment of the divine within us. So when we are creating, we are in this zone of creativity, which is connecting us with the cosmos. And so artists are cosmopolitan in two senses, both in that civic sense of building bridges with strangers, exploring other cultures, expressing empathy, but also in this moment of creation, feeling the divine cosmic origin of things in their practice. And this experience of feeling something divine is not absolutely connected and unique to artists. All of us have that capacity. We all have that capacity to be an artist, and to feel creativity in our everyday life through little acts of generosity, through little moments of recognition of somebody else's value, through reckless kinds of honesty when you're saying something that's true, even though it's not in your self-interest. These little glimmers of ideality, as one philosopher called it, these glimmers are expressive of something that's bigger than us, I think. So it's in that sense that I see artists, at both that civic and creative sense, as connecting us to the cosmos and cosmopolitanism. There was, one Korean artist who puts it very neatly. His name is Lee Ufan, and he makes paintings. Well, he used to make paintings like this. He's changed his pattern, but the principle is the same. He makes paintings which are usually a single brushstroke. A lot of thought obviously goes in preparation before he executes that brushstroke. But then when the painting is done, it's one brushstroke with a specific color on a canvas of a precise dimensions. And he says that when I am making art, he says, it's one brushstroke, one breath, each breath attuned with the cosmos. And my function as an artist is to be a conductor with the cosmos.
I understand. So in what ways do you think that this cosmic perspective can reshape how we view our roles as species on this planet.
Very good point. As species on this planet, if we are just another species on this planet,
Yeah,
which we are on that spectrum, right? It's not just us and God, but it includes everything in between.
that's right.
And and therefore, if we are physics, you know, part of physi, then we are just matter, right? With the creative consciousness inside as part of our matter. And so we have this deep responsibility to care for everything that's around us. And at the beginning of this talk, I was saying, have we left the village?
Or
In
have we taken the village with us,
Yeah, in the village,
within us?
yeah, in the village there were certain values which were very respectful of nature. You didn't overuse your fields. You let them be fallow every second year. When you planted beans here, you put tomatoes there, so that what one plant takes out of the soil, the other plant puts back in the soil. In most of the fields, there was an area where there was completely untouched. The English term for that is a copse.
Spelt?
COPSE,
Okay.
copse. In the copse, there could be a huge tree, lots of bushes. There could be foxholes, in the trees, nests for birds, rabbits, who knows. But the point is, the peasant knew that you needed to keep a certain section separate from your use. The effect of that was that those trees and its roots kept the salt levels down. It kept a certain ecology of the wildlife vibrant, which kept the food chain in order. So there was lots of things that peasants had achieved over thousands of years of living that established a certain kind of balance. Now, in the industrial era, we thought that was all backward thinking. We thought peasants were dumb and stupid. Even Karl Marx, brilliant genius that he was, considered the peasants as the awkward class that got in the way of progress. Because that vision of progress ended up being apocalyptic. It ended up doing as much harm as it did good. It wanted to elevate the role of humans, to emancipate them from the slavery that they had experienced under certain political feudal regimes and the exploitation that industrial capitalism had imposed upon it. But it threw away a lot of knowledge that had taken centuries to form. So I think the big challenge for us now is to re-articulate some of those ancient peasant values and ways of seeing and recycle of living sustainably. And so if I'm going to have a conversation with an Indigenous person, I think the best starting point is not so much for me to go and do an anthropological course about the history of Indigenous cultures. I believe a really important starting point is to understand my pre-industrial, pre-colonial heritage, to understand my own cosmologies, because little things like, in ancient Greek mythology, there's the story of the star systems called the Seven Sisters. The indigenous cultures look at the same stars and have developed exactly the same story.
That I didn't know.
Yeah,
I
it's a
know they
nice,
focus on that. That I didn't know.
yeah, so it's a cute little overlap. But my point is, the more we know about our own mythologies, the better the possibility of having overlaps and connections and references that can speak to other cultures.
Yes. So I just want to go touch on challenges in academia. When exploring the complex global themes like migration and cosmopolitanism, did you find, or were there any big personal challenges that you faced?
What do you mean by personal, Gorilla?
I know this is your expertise, but going in and doing your research, was there enough? Was it easy to find, to research about migration and cosmopolitanism?
Well,
I
look,
know now
yeah,
there's a lot of information,
yeah,
but
yeah, I see what you're saying now. I mean, institutionally, as an academic,
mhm,
um, it's if I uh, um, it's not a this is not the smart way to make a career. Like I've been very successful in generating research grants with the Australian Research Council, which you'd be familiar with. And but none of those grants that I've generated with my colleague Scott McQuire have actually been directly linked to art and migration because it doesn't really fit into the government's priorities of what it wants to fund.
okay.
And so, and Melbourne University doesn't really promote multiculturalism either, which is a shock for me to say that to you
Do you
because
think it will in the near future?
well, my brother and I fundraised to make an appointment to promote this perspective, but the fact that we had to introduce that onto the curriculum is a disgrace. You know, that the university in and of itself does not actually say multiculturalism is one of the main topics of research, one of the key subjects that we want to present to students. It's a challenge for all of us to understand. It's an experiment that this country has been engaged in and a world leader of. And yet, there was no professor of multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism at the University of Melbourne.
Oh.
Nobody's job description said, and this is your key task.
But wouldn't that make sense to start that in secondary
I
schools
agree.
for the
It
young
should,
to
it
close that
should,
gap of racism?
we have Harmony Day at primary schools.
Okay, so we've got Harmony Day in primary school, but how are we closing the gap of
Yeah, that's
racism
my
if we're not
question. Just
teaching the young
it's
about
just left.
multicultural connection?
Yeah, it's just left in this sort of whatever category. It's something people do in their spare time. It's not seen as a civic, as one of the key factors that hold our society together. And failing to see that is turning a blind eye. It's perhaps an example of our unconscious racism, that we still can't see that this key part of our society, what should be a pillar of our society, is absolutely absent from our pedagogy. It's a disgrace. Melbourne University did not have one professor that was dedicated to this task. And it was introduced to Melbourne University from the fundraising led by the Greek community.
Wow.
So that's another gift we've given this society. Now, how they choose to honor that and develop that and cultivate that, well, the responsibility is on them, but it's also our job to pester them, to check on them and say, what are you doing? How is it growing? What can be done to make it better? So the reality is, it didn't exist at the beginning of my career. It still doesn't exist. I've had to find ways to do it in between things. Rob Peter to pay Paul sort of thing. So I run all these other grants and try and steal a little bit of time while I'm doing those grants to do this kind of research. And I wrote the Cosmos book during my long service leave. I was meant to be having so-called recreation time, but during that time, I wrote that book, and Anyway,
As I
so that
said, you turned a not a good situation into something positive.
I tried.
That's it. I want to ask for people that are looking of following in your footsteps, balancing personal and academic life. How do you maintain the balance between your academic work, writing, and your personal life?
That's becoming harder and harder. The duty of teaching has expanded. It's no longer just go into the classroom and deliver. There's 1,001 administrative tasks you have to do, a whole heap of compliance issues you have to constantly keep up with, and the bureaucratic burden just escalates year after year. The expectation to maintain a research and publication profile is also imperative because you won't get promoted without one. You won't even get appointed without one. So it's a very strange world. And the other reality is, in order to progress, you have to generate income for research
Yes.
to be able to have time to publish, and so it's a catch-22. This is why I was saying I was very successful. I was always under the umbrella of a research project. Like I always had money to do research. So I was in an incredibly lucky and privileged, but I worked very hard to achieve that with my friend Scott McQuire. And that gave me more freedom than most people. And
So, when you look back, I'm interrupting you, so I do
that's right.
apologize, but when you look back on your career in years to come and the books that you've written, what do you hope your legacy will be? Or how would you like to be remembered in the field of cultural theory and migration studies and multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism?
Well, I'd like to think that I contributed, first of all, in making people conscious that artists are not just there to decorate and represent the world in a nice and interesting way. They're also involved in not just reflecting reality, but making other possibilities. And that making world of worlds is is the making of a cosmopolitan world. So I'd like to be remembered as someone who's contributed in that understanding of artists as agents for change, for agents for hope, and agents for a cosmopolitan world. I'd also like to think that I wrote a book called The Turbulence of Migration, which challenged many of the orthodoxies about theories that explained migration. At the beginning, there was a sort of tendency to try and explain migration in a very mechanistic way, like the Marxist perspective was that the capitalists control the economy, and the economy determines the need for migrants, and migrants follow where the jobs are, right? And so it basically said capitalism has the levers that controls the economy because the economy is like a machine, and migrants are just sort of like unwittingly being drawn like feelings that get attracted to magnets, right? And just get zipping around the world. The other perspective at that time was this more liberal, voluntaristic, individualistic perspective. No, no, artists, migrants are free agents. They choose to go where they want to go. They go everywhere and anywhere, and it's up to them whether they can get in or out, or you know. And I always thought these two extremes were too far apart. And so when you look at the patterns that migrants make when they move around the world, it's not as linear as either of the two models propose. In fact, the patterns are much more complex, more turbulent. People come for short periods of time, they go. They choose to go to some places, but they are controlled by other forces.
Yeah.
So I developed an intermediary concept of turbulence, which sort of recognized the importance of structures like the economic structure, appreciated the significant role that individual choice makes, but also said there are other forces that are at play: culture, society, history, and so on, and tried to create a theory around the turbulence of migration patterns. That book has been very influential. Um, it was cited by a former director of the United Nations High Commission of Refugees. It's been, published in 4 or 5 different editions. And and I'm very proud of that book. Now I want to focus more on writing that's more accessible, like the John Berger book. I want to.
Is there anything else new that you'd like to explore and
Oh,
writing about?
I'm in the middle of 3 or 4 books right now, and
How do
so
you do that? How do you focus on working on 3 to 4 books at the same time?
well, you do it at different times of the day.
That that's interesting within itself. Have you got any personal goals that um, you want to explore in the future?
Well, I bought a little house in Greece in Egina, and I want to save up a little bit more money and build a nice little house on that block of land in Egina and spend more time there. So that's a big personal goal. I'm enjoying doing more yoga and swimming. That's a lovely thing that I do now,
Which is
and
good for mental health as well and just keeping you
absolutely
grounded.
keeping you on the ground and going for long walks with my brother in the tan and people like that, and my friend Jim Bossanakis. And I also like cooking every now and then.
One of your favorite meals that you like to dish out?
Oh, well, I like making a big bowl, a really big pot of soup with lots of vegetables and various things. I also love cooking lamb. It's my
You're
on
definitely
Sunday.
Greek. You're definitely Greek.
Sorry about that.
No, 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 don't be sorry. Nick, thank you so, so much
My
on the
pleasure.
inside and really opening up and explaining things thoroughly. Um, yeah, it's a unique story, and I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to speak with you and to talk about your books. You definitely was a big interest in when I, did some research on you. So
My,
thank you so, so much.
my pleasure, Rolla. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Take care.